Stop reacting to everything. Train your brain to stay in control. Most people do not choose their actions. They react to words, to stress, to the behavior of other people, to the unexpected event, to the notification on the phone, to the tone in the email, to the traffic that made them late and the colleague who interrupted them and the partner who said the thing they always say. They react to all of it, constantly, automatically, and without the awareness that a choice was available in the moment when the reaction executed. And because of that, because their behavior is primarily the output of automatic reactions rather than deliberate choices, they are predictable. The people around them know which inputs produce which outputs. The triggers are known, the patterns are established. The reactive person is, in the most specific and most practical sense, available to be managed by anyone who understands the pattern, who knows which input reliably produces which behavioral output. This audiobook is about breaking that pattern, not about becoming emotionless or robotic or disconnected from the genuine richness of emotional experience. About becoming someone who thinks before acting, who has built the specific internal architecture that places the deliberate mind between the incoming stimulus and the outgoing behavioral response, so that the response is the expression of a choice rather than the execution of an automatic pattern. The pattern is not destiny, it is infrastructure, specifically the neural infrastructure of the habitual reaction, built through years of repetition, operating automatically because it has been practiced automatically. Infrastructure can be rebuilt. The neural pathways that support the reactive pattern can be weakened through disuse, and the competing pathways that support the deliberate response can be strengthened through consistent practice. The pattern is changeable. The change requires the specific, consistent practices that this audiobook develops. By the end of this audiobook, you will have a fundamentally different relationship to the inputs that most consistently produce your automatic reactions. Not because the inputs will have changed, they will not. Because you will have built the specific architecture that places a real choice between the input and the output. A choice that most people do not know they have. A choice that is the foundation of every other form of genuine self-governance. Introduction. The pattern that governs without permission. The reactive pattern is not the conscious choice to react. It is the absence of a conscious choice at all. The pattern that governs without permission is the habitual, automatic, pre-deliberate sequence of stimulus and response that most people's behavior consists of in most of their daily interactions. The stimulus arrives. The pattern recognizes it as belonging to a category. The category has an associated behavioral response. The response executes. All of this happens before the deliberate mind has been consulted, before the choice of whether to respond this way has been available to the person whose behavior it is. The specific harm of the pattern governing without permission is not primarily any single reactive instance. It is the accumulated experience of being the person whose behavior is produced by the pattern rather than by the deliberate self. The person who has been reactive for long enough begins to understand themselves as a reactive person, as someone for whom this is simply how they function, how they respond, who they are. The identity closes around the pattern. And when the identity has closed around the pattern, breaking the pattern feels like breaking the self. This is the deepest work of this audiobook. Not just the interruption of the automatic reaction, though that is necessary. The rebuilding of the identity around the deliberate response, so that the deliberate response is the natural expression of who you are rather than the effortful exception to the reactive default. The pattern governed without permission. The development builds the governance. Chapter 1. The habit of reacting. You do not choose your reactions, they happen automatically. The automatic quality of the habitual reaction is the first thing to understand about it, not to excuse it, but to understand it accurately enough to address it. The reaction that happens automatically is not happening because the person chose not to think first. It is happening because the person's cognitive system has built a direct, high-efficiency pathway from the specific stimulus category to the specific behavioral response, through the repetition of many previous instances of the same stimulus-response sequence. The automaticity is the product of the practice, not deliberate practice, the unintended practice of repeating the same reactive pattern many times, which builds the same neural infrastructure that deliberate practice builds in the direction of the reactive pattern rather than the deliberate alternative. What automatic reactions look like in daily life is the texture of the ordinary day experienced from the inside of the reactive default. The alarm goes off and the immediate response is the groaning reach for the phone, not a chosen start to the day, but the automatic execution of the established morning pattern. The email arrives with a tone that triggers the familiar defensive feeling, and the response is drafted in the activation of the feeling before the deliberate assessment of what response the situation actually warrants. The meeting goes in an unexpected direction, and the immediate reaction is the visible frustration that everyone in the room registers before the deliberate choice about what to communicate has been made. The scale of the daily automatic reaction pattern is significant and typically underestimated by the people living inside it. The count of the genuinely deliberate behavioral choices made in an ordinary day, the choices that were preceded by the actual assessment of the situation, the actual evaluation of the options, and the actual selection of the response based on the genuine requirements of the situation is a fraction of the total behavioral outputs produced. Most of what most people do most of the time is the automatic execution of the established patterns, not the product of the deliberate choice. The emotional reflex versus conscious thinking distinction is the specific cognitive contrast between the two modes of behavioral production. The emotional reflex is the fast, pre-deliberate, pattern-matched output that the automatic reaction represents. The conscious thinking is the slow, deliberate, situation-assessed output that the governed response represents. Both produce behavioral outputs. The outputs look similar in many ordinary situations. Both produce adequate responses to the common stimuli that the patterns were built to handle. The outputs diverge significantly in the situations where the pattern is not a good match for the current requirements, the novel situation, the high-stakes situation, the situation where the past pattern is calibrated to a past reality that the current situation has moved beyond. How repeated reactions become identity is the specific long-term developmental mechanism that makes the habit of reacting more than just a behavioral pattern. It makes it a self-concept. The person who has reacted defensively to criticism in the presence of others many times has not just produced a behavioral pattern. They have built, through the accumulated evidence of many instances of the same behavior, the self-understanding of being someone who gets defensive about criticism. The behavior produces the evidence builds the identity. The identity reinforces the behavior. The cycle is self-sustaining. The identity reinforcement of the reactive pattern is the most resistant layer of the reactivity cycle to change, because it adds the self-consistency motivation to the neural automaticity. The person who understands themselves as a reactive person is not just running an automatic pattern when they react, they are being consistent with who they believe they are. Changing the behavior requires changing the self-understanding, which requires the accumulated evidence of the alternative behavior that gradually builds the alternative identity. This is the long project of Chapter 9 and 10. And it is the project that the 7 chapters between this one and those are preparing for. You do not choose your reactions. They happen automatically. This is the honest starting point, not the judgment of the person who reacts, but the accurate description of the neural mechanism that is producing the behavior. The mechanism is changeable. The change begins with the honest understanding of the mechanism, which this chapter provides. Everything that follows is the specific practice of the change. Chapter 2. Why you react without thinking. You are not weak. You are programmed. The word programmed is precise and deliberate. The reactive pattern is not a moral failing, not a sign of weakness, not the evidence of poor character. It is the output of a cognitive system that has been shaped by evolution, by development, and by the accumulated experience of the specific environment the person has navigated to produce fast, automatic, pattern-matched behavioral responses to the incoming stimuli that it has learned to categorize. This shaping is the programming. And like all programming, it can be reprogrammed not by the dramatic decision to be different, but by the specific, consistent, patient process of building the new infrastructure that the new responses require. The brain shortcut system is the specific neurological architecture of the reactive pattern's automaticity. The shortcut system, the fast, associative, pattern-matching cognitive process, is not the inferior version of the brain's processing. It is the efficient version, designed to handle the enormous volume of incoming stimuli that the complex social and physical environment produces by matching them to established categories and producing the associated responses, without the cognitively expensive process of full deliberate analysis for every input. The shortcut system is genuinely useful for the large majority of situations. It handles the routine stimuli, the familiar situations, the inputs that closely match the established categories. The problem is its application to situations that superficially match the established categories but are actually different in important ways. The shortcut does not notice the important differences. It matches to the category and executes the associated response without the deliberate verification that the match is accurate. The reactive behavior in these situations is the accurate execution of the wrong category. Emotional speed versus rational delay is the specific temporal asymmetry that determines which system produces the behavioral output in high activation situations. The emotional system completes its assessment and generates its response in milliseconds. The rational system requires seconds or longer. In the ordinary situations where both systems agree on the appropriate response, the speed difference is irrelevant. The emotional system gets there first. The rational system confirms, and the behavior is the same either way. In the high activation situations where the two systems would produce different responses, the speed difference is decisive. The emotional system produces its output first, and the rational system arrives to find that the behavioral commitment has already been made. Why thinking takes effort is the specific cognitive reality that explains why the deliberate, Rational response is not the natural default. The deliberate thinking process requires the sustained, directed engagement of the prefrontal cognitive system, the working memory, the inhibitory control, the consequence evaluation, the option generation. These processes consume the limited cognitive resource that the prefrontal system has available. They are slower because they are more thorough. They are more thorough because the thoroughness is what produces the quality improvement over the shortcut. And they are effortful because the resource they consume is finite and depletable. The specific implication of the effort cost of deliberate thinking is that the deliberate response is least available in the conditions where it is most needed: the high activation, high stress, high-stakes situations that also consume the most prefrontal resource through the management of the activation itself. The cognitive resource that would support the deliberate thinking is being partially consumed by the regulation of the activated state that the difficult situation has produced. The residual resource available for the deliberate thinking is reduced precisely when the deliberate thinking is most required. This is why the practices developed in this audiobook do not primarily depend on the in-the-moment deployment of deliberate thinking from inside the high activation state. They depend instead on the pre-built infrastructure that makes the deliberate response more automatic, on the habits, the pre-commitments, the practiced patterns that have reduced the resource requirement of the deliberate response through the repetition that all automation reduces effort through. You are not weak, you are programmed. The programming can be reprogrammed. The reprogramming is the 10 chapters of this audiobook. This chapter has named the mechanism. The following chapters develop the specific practices that change it. Chapter 3. The cost of reactivity. Reactions feel fast, but they create long consequences. The temporal asymmetry between the speed of the reaction and the duration of its consequences is one of the most fundamental features of the reactive pattern's cost structure. And it is the specific feature that makes the cost so difficult to see from inside the pattern. The reaction is over in seconds. The consequences develop over hours, days, months, years. The reaction and its full cost are temporally separated in ways that prevent the natural feedback loop that would otherwise teach the person producing the reaction that the reaction was costly. Damaged relationships are the most consistent and most significant long-term cost of the reactive pattern, and they accumulate through the specific mechanism described in Chapter 1 of the Emotional Discipline audiobook, not through single catastrophic exchanges, but through the accumulated texture of many small reactive instances that gradually erode the quality of the relationship. The slightly sharp reply, the defensive withdrawal when engagement was needed, the expressed frustration that communicated something about the reactive person's assessment of the other person that the reactive person did not intend to communicate. Each of these is small. Each registers in the other person's model of the reactive person. The model, built from many small instances, eventually produces the specific adjustment in the other person's engagement, the things they stop saying, the topics they stop raising, the trust they stop extending that constitutes the relationship cost of the reactive pattern. Poor decisions are the second major cost of reactivity, and they operate through the specific time frame compression mechanism described in Chapter 2 of the Build Unshakable Self-Control audiobook. The reactive decision is made from the activated state's time frame, the very short horizon of what relieves the current activation, what resolves the immediate discomfort, What produces the fastest satisfaction of the urgency the activation is generating? Decisions made from this time frame are systematically under-elaborated to the longer consequences that extend beyond the immediate horizon. The reactive decision is not wrong in the narrow sense of being irrational. It is often the perfectly reasonable response to the emotional state's assessment of the situation. It is wrong in the practical sense of producing outcomes that, from the longer frame perspective of days or months, are clearly suboptimal. The loss of control over life direction is the third and most fundamental cost of sustained reactivity, the gradual yielding of the governance of the life trajectory to the automatic patterns rather than the deliberate choices. The life that is produced by the accumulated automatic reactions is not the life that the deliberate choices would have produced. It is the life that the patterns produced, which is the life that the patterns were built to produce, calibrated to the conditions of the past that shaped them rather than to the genuine priorities and values of the person living it. A loss of directional control is subtle because the individual instances of the automatic reaction each appear small. Each individual reactive decision, each individual small reactive communication, each individual automatic behavioral output is not obviously the redirection of a life trajectory. It is the accumulated pattern of many such instances across time that constitutes the trajectory, and the trajectory produced by the accumulated reactive pattern is the trajectory shaped by the pattern's built-in responses to the past conditions that built it, not the trajectory that the person's genuine deliberate values and genuine long-term priorities would have produced. The awareness of this costs the honest confrontation with the gap between the life the reactive pattern is producing and the life that the genuine deliberate choices would produce is the specific motivational foundation of the development that this audiobook requires. Not the dramatic self-rumination of the person who has finally seen the damage clearly, but the calm, honest, forward-pointing recognition that the current trajectory is the product of the current pattern, and that the current pattern is changeable through the specific practices that the following chapters develop. Reactions feel fast. The speed is real. The consequences are long. The awareness of the temporal asymmetry is the specific cognitive intervention that begins the motivation for the change, the deliberate extension of the assessment of the reactive option beyond the immediate relief it produces to the downstream costs that the time frame of the activation state is systematically suppressing. That extended assessment is the first specific practice of the Stopping Decretion project. Chapter 4 develops the next one. Chapter 4. Slowing down the reaction. If you slow down, you already won. The paradox of the slowdown in the reactive situation is the same paradox described in several earlier audiobooks of this series. The situation is pressing toward speed. The activation is generating urgency, and the specific action that produces the most significant advantage is the deliberate, under-pressure reduction of pace. The paradox resolves when the mechanism is understood. The speed that the urgency is pressing toward is the speed of the reactive pattern's execution, which is the speed of the pattern rather than the speed of the genuine response. Slowing down is not the abandonment of speed where speed is genuinely required. It is the refusal to be rushed into the reactive pattern by the manufactured urgency that the activation generates. Breaking urgency is the first specific element of the slowing down practice. And it requires the specific distinction between genuine urgency, where the delay genuinely costs more than the benefit of the improved response quality, and manufactured urgency, where the feeling of urgency is the product of the activation state rather than the accurate assessment of the decision timeline. The manufactured urgency, as established in earlier chapters of this series, is the product of the emotional system's time frame compression. The activation state makes everything feel immediate, pressing, requiring response now. The deliberate examination of the genuine timeline, what actually happens if I take 30 seconds, 30 minutes, or 30 hours before responding, almost always reveals that the urgency is significantly overstated. Awareness before response is the second specific element, the deliberate engagement of the observer position before the behavioral output is produced. The observer position in the reactive moment is the brief, internal stepping back from the activated participant role to the monitoring role, the role that can see the activation for what it is, the emotional system's response to the pattern match, rather than what it presents itself as, the accurate and urgent assessment of the situation that demands the immediate response. This brief internal observation does not need to be long. It needs to be genuine, the actual recognition that the reaction is beginning rather than the automatic execution of the reaction without any awareness of the sequence. The awareness practice in the reactive moment is the practical application of the trigger mapping practice from Chapter 3 of the Emotional Discipline audiobook. The trigger-mapped person knows which inputs reliably produce which activations in them. The trigger-mapped person in the moment of the trigger has the advantage of recognition. I know this trigger. I know what this activation is. I know what the automatic pattern is about to produce. That recognition is the intervention, not the elimination of the activation, but the specific awareness of its presence that opens the possibility of the deliberate response instead of the automatic one. Creating mental space is the third element of the slowing down practice, the specific production of the psychological interval between the trigger and the output in which the deliberate response becomes possible. The mental space is produced by the brief pause, the deliberate breath, the physical slowing that reduces the urgency signals and restores partial access to the deliberate cognitive mode. Mental space is not a permanent state, it is the brief interval, created deliberately, that allows the deliberate mind to occupy the governance position before the reactive output has been generated. Building the slowing down capacity requires the consistent practice of the slowdown in the ordinary low-activation situations of daily life. The non-urgent email that is read and given the deliberate 20-second pause before the reply is drafted. The minor frustration that is acknowledged and given the deliberate breath before the expression is produced. The simple social exchange that is given the deliberate moment of reception before the response is generated. These ordinary practice sessions are building the neural infrastructure of the slowing habit that will be available in the high activation situations where slowing is most valuable and most difficult. If you slow down, you already won. The specific win of the slowdown is not the victory of having thought carefully before responding, though that is the pathway to better responses. The win of the slowdown is the specific win of having maintained the governance of the deliberate mind in the moment when the reactive pattern was pressing to take over. Each slowing down is a successful governance exercise. Each governance exercise builds the habit of governance. The habit is what produces the long-term transformation from the reactive to the deliberate behavioral default. Chapter 5 develops the specific, most practical expression of the slowing down practice, the pause in its most operationally powerful form, the myropakos in conversation and real-time social interaction. Chapter 5. The Power of the Pause. One pause can change the outcome of an entire conversation. The pause is the most practically powerful single tool in the anti-greetivity practice, and its power is disproportionate to its simplicity. It is disproportionate because the pause does something that no amount of subsequent damage control can replicate. It keeps the reactive output from being produced in the first place. Once the reactive output has been produced, the sharp reply, the defensive escalation, the impulsive commitment, the situation has been shaped by it, and every subsequent action takes place in the context of the consequences the reactive output has created. The pause prevents the creating of those consequences, which makes every subsequent action take place in the uncontaminated context of the situation before the reactive output shaped it. Myropauses in conversation are the specific application of the pause practice to the real-time social interaction context, the context in which the reactive pattern is most powerfully activated and most difficult to interrupt because the social norm of prompt reciprocal response is pressing directly against the deliberate pause that the anti-reactivity practice requires. The myropause is not the extended, obvious pause that calls attention to itself and creates the social awkwardness that the norm against silence produces. It is the 2 to 3 second interval between the incoming statement and the outgoing response that is within the natural rhythm of thoughtful conversation, brief enough to be socially unremarkable, long enough to allow the deliberate cognitive process to begin. The specific cognitive work that the myropause enables in the 2 to 3 seconds of its duration is not elaborate. It is specific, the brief acknowledgement of the activation state. What am I feeling right now? The brief assessment of the reactive pattern. What would I automatically say? And the brief question of whether the automatic output serves the genuine requirements of this situation. Is that the response that actually serves what I want to produce here? These three micro-assessments can be completed in the interval of the natural conversational pause. Together, they are the specific difference between the reactive output and the deliberate one. Interrupting emotional reactions in the conversational context requires the specific awareness of the activation signal that the myropause practice is built on. The activation signal is the felt sense of the reactive pattern engaging, the familiar quality of the defensive response beginning to build, the familiar urgency of the impulse to correct or to escalate or to disengage. The recognition of this felt sense as the activation beginning rather than as the accurate and urgent assessment of the situation that the activation presents itself as is the specific cognitive intervention that makes the myropause available as a choice rather than as the deliberate interruption of an already exuding response. Choosing instead of reacting is the operational description of what the myropause produces, the specific transition from the automatic execution of the pattern to the deliberate selection of the response. The choice is not always a dramatically different choice from what the pattern would have produced. Sometimes the deliberate assessment confirms that the automatic response was appropriate. What the choice produces is the specific quality of behavioral ownership. The response is produced by the person's deliberate assessment rather than by the pattern's automatic execution. The same words, produced by the choice rather than by the pattern, have a different quality, a different relationship to the person's genuine assessment even when the surface content is identical. Building the Myropause habit requires the same practice approach as all the habit building work in this audiobook and series, the consistent application and the low captivation. Ordinary social situations of daily life. Building the automaticity of the pause before it is needed in the high captivation situations where building it from scratch is not possible. The specific practice in ordinary conversation is the deliberate one-beat delay before responses, the discipline of receiving what has been said before generating the response, rather than generating the response while the other person is still speaking. This practice is simultaneously the Myropause habit and the genuine listening practice, the attentive reception of what was actually said, followed by the deliberate response to what was actually said, rather than the simultaneous preparation of the response to what is being said while it is still being said. One pause can change the outcome of an entire conversation. The mechanism of the change is the specific prevention of the reactive output that the pause creates, the keeping of the conversation in the context of what was actually said rather than the context of the reactive response that the pattern had prepared. The conversation that proceeds from the genuine response is a different conversation from the conversation that proceeds from the reactive output. The long-term relationship quality built from many genuine conversations is a different quality from the relationship built from many reactive exchanges. The pause is tiny. The compound effect of many pauses across many conversations across many years is enormous. Chapter 6. Rewiring emotional patterns. You are not required to respond the same way you always have. The rewiring of the emotional pattern is the specific work of changing the underlying neural infrastructure that the reactive pattern represents, not managing the pattern from above, applying the pause and the deliberate response as a layer on top of the unchanged underlying system. Actually changing the underlying system progressively through the consistent application of the alternative behavior that builds the competing infrastructure. The distinction between managing the pattern and rewiring it is the distinction between the effortful maintenance of the alternative behavior and the natural expression of it. The managed pattern requires the continuous resource investment of the deliberate override, the constant vigilance, the frequent application of the pause, the ongoing resistance to the automatic pull of the established pattern. The rewired pattern has changed its automatic pull. The new behavior is now the natural expression of the rebuilt infrastructure, requiring less conscious effort to produce because it is less competing with the established pattern. Recognizing patterns is the first component of the rewiring practice. The pattern that has not been explicitly identified cannot be deliberately changed. It operates invisibly, producing its outputs without the awareness of the pattern's role in producing them. The pattern that has been explicitly identified, the specific trigger, the specific activation, the specific automatic response, the specific cost is available for the deliberate work of the rewiring. The identification is not comfortable. It requires the honest acknowledgement that the behavior that felt like the appropriate response was the automatic execution of a pattern rather than the deliberate choice. But the discomfort of the identification is the specific prerequisite for the possibility of the change. Replacing reactions follows the specific habit loop rewiring practice described in Chapter 5 of the Build Unshakable Self-Control audiobook. The identification of the existing loop cue, routine, reward, the design of the alternative routine that serves the same need at lower cost, and the consistent practice of the alternative routine in the presence of the cue across the many repetitions that build the competing infrastructure. The replacement is not the suppression of the existing loop. The loop will continue to fire when the cue is present. The replacement is the building of a competing loop that fires alongside the existing one and, through consistent activation, progressively becomes the dominant response. Building new neural habits is the long-term dimension of the rewiring practice, the recognition that genuine neural restructuring requires the consistent application of the new behavior across a timeline of weeks to months before the new pattern has built sufficient infrastructure to compete effectively with the established one. The early weeks of the rewiring practice are the most demanding because the established pattern is most dominant and the competing pattern is least built. The middle weeks show the first signs of the reduced dominance of the established pattern. The later months show the progressive naturalization of the new behavior, the reduction in the effortfulness of the deliberate response as the infrastructure of the new pattern strengthens. The specific emotional patterns that most commonly require rewiring are the categories described in Chapter 3 of the Emotional Triggers audiobook: the defensive pattern activated by inputs that resemble criticism, the escalation pattern activated by inputs that resemble disrespect, the anxiety withdrawal pattern activated by inputs that resemble rejection, and the impulsive commitment pattern activated by the excitement of the immediately appealing opportunity. Each of these has a specific cue, the category of input, a specific routine, the automatic behavioral response, and a specific reward, the immediate relief, the expression of the feeling, the reduction of the discomfort. The rewiring replaces the routine while maintaining the reward, designs the alternative behavior that serves the same need the original routine was serving. You are not required to respond the same way you always have. The requirement is the infrastructure of the established pattern, which is the requirement of the accumulated past practice, not the requirement of who you genuinely are. The rewiring is the building of the new infrastructure through the new practice, the deliberate, consistent, patient practice of the alternative response across the many repetitions that make it the new default. Not quickly, not dramatically, but genuinely, measurably, permanently. Chapter 7: Emotional Control in Real Situations. Control is tested in the moment. The practices developed in the preceding 6 chapters are the preparation for the real situations in which the emotional control is needed, the situations where the triggers are present. The stakes are high, the social pressure is real, and the automatic reactive pattern is pressing with its full force toward the behavioral output that the practice is built to prevent. This chapter addresses the specific demands of 3 of the most consistently challenging real situation categories and the specific application of the practices to each. Conflict situations are the most demanding test of emotional control because they contain the maximum concentration of the factors that produce reactive behavior, the social pressure of the reciprocal escalation dynamic, the status threat of being challenged or dismissed, the emotional activation of the perceived injustice or disrespect, and the time compression of the real-time social exchange that does not allow the extended pause that the clockwork activation situations permit. The specific practice for the conflict situation begins before the conflict is joined, not after it has begun. The anticipatory recognition, the awareness that the situation developing in front of you is approaching the conflict territory that activates your specific reactive patterns, is the most valuable intervention point because the activation level is still low enough for the deliberate cognitive mode to be fully engaged. At the early stage, the practice is the deliberate decision-making about the engagement. Is this the right moment for this conflict? What is the genuine objective? What response from the other party am I prepared for? And what is the specific practice I will apply when the activation rises? These pre-engagement questions are the practical expression of the anticipatory preparation that the trigger mapping practice makes possible. The person who has mapped the conflict triggers and prepared the specific regulatory practices is not encountering the conflict unprepared. They are encountering a situation they have practiced for in the lower intensity training sessions and in the specific mental preparation for the known type of challenging interaction. The specific practices in the active conflict moment or the sequence developed in Chapter 8 of the Emotional Intelligence in Conflict section of the Emotional Discipline Audiobook. Physiological regulation. First, the breath that reduces the activation level before the deliberate cognitive engagement is attempted. Content discipline. Second, to maintain focus on the specific substantive issue rather than the relational escalation. And adversarial empathy. Third, the accurate modeling of the other party's actual position rather than the conflict narrative's amplified version. Stress reactions are the second major real situation category. The specific challenge of the stress context is the cumulative depletion of the regulatory resource. The sustained stress depletes the prefrontal capacity that the deliberate response requires, which means the reactive pattern faces progressively less competition as the stress extends. The specific practice for the stress context is the recovery cycle. The deliberate, genuine periods of disengagement from the stress-producing demands that restore the depleted resource. The recovery is not optional in the sustained stress context. Without it, the progressive depletion of the regulatory resource progressively returns the behavioral governance to the reactive pattern regardless of the development that the preceding 6 chapters have produced. Social pressure is the third real situation category, the specific challenge of the social environment that is pressing toward a specific behavioral output through the combined force of the norm, the expectation, and the group consensus. The social pressure context activates the social proof heuristic that has been described in the Think Clearly chapter of this series, the cognitive shortcut that uses others' behavior as the guide to the appropriate response in ambiguous situations. The deliberate practice in the social pressure context is the monitoring of the assessment source. Is this response my deliberate evaluation of the situation? Or is it the adoption of the group's consensus under social pressure? The monitoring question maintains the independence of the assessment in the conditions where the social pressure is most specifically pressing to replace it. Control is tested in the moment. The test is genuinely demanding and genuinely reviewing. The person who has built the practices described in this audiobook will not pass every test. The development is gradual and the tests are real. What will progressively improve is the proportion of the tests that are met with the deliberate response rather than the reactive pattern, and the speed and the completeness of the recovery when the pattern wins around. Each test is a training session. Each training session builds the capacity. The capacity is what determines how the next test goes. Chapter 8. Thinking before acting. Between thought and action, your freedom. The freedom in the hook is the specific cognitive and behavioral freedom described throughout this audiobook and this series, the freedom of the person whose behavior is produced by their deliberate assessment rather than by the automatic pattern. The freedom exists in the interval between the thought, the recognition of the situation, the feeling of the activation, the arising of the impulse and the action. That interval is the pause. The thinking that occupies the interval is the specific exercise of the freedom. And the action that follows the thinking is the genuinely chosen behavior rather than the automatically executed pattern. Rational filters are the specific cognitive tools that the thinking bifurcating practice deploys in the interval. The three filters introduced in the Think Clearly audiobook apply here directly. The time frame extension. What does this produce in the longer frame? The alternatives question. Is the automatic response the only available one? And the values alignment check. Is this the behavior of the person I am choosing to be? In the thinking bifurcating context, these filters are the specific diagnostic through which the proposed automatic action is evaluated before the commitment to it is made. The time frame extension is the filter that most directly addresses the impulsive action's core vulnerability, the time frame compression that makes the long-term cost of the impulsive action invisible at the moment of the impulse. The brief, deliberate extension of the evaluation to the longer frame. What does this produce in a week, a month, a year? Is not the elaborate analysis that the comfortable conditions would allow. It is the brief, honest acknowledgement of the specific longer-term costs that the impulsive action typically produces in the category it belongs to. Evaluating outcomes is the second element of the thinking bifurcating practice, the specific assessment of the realistic consequences of the proposed action rather than the consequences that the activation state is generating in its compressed and amplified form. The evaluation is not a prediction of the specific outcome. The specific outcome is genuinely uncertain. It is the assessment of the realistic range of outcomes, including the ones the activation state is suppressing as well as the ones it is amplifying, and the evaluation of the proposed action against this more complete range. Strategic responses are the output of the thinking bifurcating practice, the specific responses that are calibrated to the genuine requirements of the situation rather than to the satisfaction of the activation state's demands. The strategic response considers the longer frame, evaluates the full range of likely outcomes, and selects the response that most effectively serves the genuine purposes in the situation. This is not the elaborate calculation of every possible downstream consequence. It is the brief, specific extension of the assessment beyond the immediate that the pause makes available. The development of the thinking bifurcating practice as a habit rather than an occasional deliberate intervention requires the same progressive loading and consistent repetition that all the habit building in this audiobook describes. The consistent application of the three filters in the ordinary low-activation decisions of daily life builds the habit that makes them available in the high-activation decisions where they are most needed. The habit is the infrastructure. The infrastructure is what makes the freedom of the interval available automatically rather than as the effortful, deliberate intervention against the reactive pattern. Between thought and action, your freedom, the freedom is real. It is also built, not received. It is built through the specific, consistent practice of using the interval deliberately, rather than allowing the reactive pattern to collapse it to zero. The interval grows with practice. The thinking that occupies it improves with practice. The actions that follow it become more genuinely chosen with practice. The accumulation of many genuinely chosen actions across many situations over time is the accumulated expression of the freedom that the thinking bifurcating practice develops. Chapter 9. Becoming mentally stable. Stability is a skill. The skill framing of mental stability is the specific reframe that makes its development available to the person who currently experiences themselves as the reactive, unstable version and cannot see a path from where they are to the stable version they would prefer to be. Stability as a trait is either there or it is not. It is the natural endowment of certain temperaments and the natural absence in others. Stability as a skill is built through the specific practices that this audiobook describes, applied consistently across a sufficient time period that the neural infrastructure of this stable behavior has been built to the level where it expresses itself naturally rather than requiring the effortful maintenance of the deliberate practice. Emotional discipline is the ongoing dimension of the stability skill, the day-to-day, situation-by-situation application of the practices that keep the deliberate mind in the governance position between the emotional experience and the behavioral output. The emotional discipline is not a permanent achievement of a stable state. It is the continuous practice of maintaining the governance across the variable conditions that daily life produces, the easy conditions where the governance is natural and the difficult conditions where the governance requires genuine regulatory resource and genuine discipline to maintain. Consistency is the behavioral expression of the developed emotional discipline, the maintained standard of behavioral quality across the full range of conditions, from the comfortable to the genuinely difficult. Consistency is the specific quality that others experience as trustworthiness, the specific knowledge that this person will behave according to their values and their character regardless of the conditions that might otherwise excuse the departure from them. Building the consistency requires the specific practice of the governed behavior in the difficult conditions, not only in the comfortable ones. The consistency that only holds in comfortable conditions is not consistency, it is condition-dependent adequacy. The consistency that holds in difficult conditions is the genuine article. Calm mindset is the internal orientation of the mentally stable person, the specific relationship to the incoming experiences and activations that the developed stability produces. The calm mindset does not experience the difficult situation as the threat that the activated state presents it as. It experiences the difficult situation as the condition that the developed capacities are equal to, as the test rather than the catastrophe, the challenge rather than the emergency. This relationship is not available at the beginning of the development. It is the product of the accumulated evidence from many tests navigated with the developed capacities, the specific self-knowledge that the stability is real because it has been demonstrated. The specific development trajectory of the calm mindset is the trajectory from the aspiration, I want to be more stable, through the practice phase, I am consistently applying the specific practices across the ordinary and the difficult situations, to the identity integration, I am a stable person, because the evidence of many instances demonstrates it. Each phase requires the specific investment that it requires. The aspiration phase produces no development without the practice. The practice phase produces the neural infrastructure without yet the identity. The identity phase is the arrival at the natural expression, the point where the stability is who you are rather than what you are maintaining. Stability is a skill. The skill is built through the practices described in this audiobook. The building requires time. The neural restructuring that genuine stability requires takes months of consistent practice, not the days of the initial motivation. The building requires consistency. The accumulated infrastructure is built from many practice sessions, not from the occasional dramatic effort. and the building produces the genuine article, the mental stability that holds in the difficult conditions. That is the natural expression of the developed person rather than the effortful maintenance of a goal. Chapter 10. Living without reactivity. When you stop reacting, you start leading. The life without reactivity is not the life without feeling. This is the clarification that this final chapter begins with, because it is the most fundamental misunderstanding of the destination that this audiobook is building toward. The life without reactivity is the life in which the feelings are fully present, fully felt, fully informative, and in which the behavioral output is the deliberate choice of the person who is having the feelings rather than the automatic execution of the established patterns. The leadership that begins when the reactivity stops is the specific form of self-leadership that all the audiobooks in this series have been pointing toward, the governance of your own behavior from the deliberate assessment of what your genuine values and genuine purposes require rather than from the automatic patterns execution of the established response. When you lead yourself, when the behavioral output is genuinely yours rather than the patterns, you are in a fundamentally different relationship to the life you are living, not at the mercy of the triggers, not predictable to the people who know the patterns, not surrendering the governance of the life trajectory to the accumulated defaults of the past. Conscious living is the specific quality of the life that the developed non-creativity produces. The conscious life is not the exhaustingly deliberate life in which every small decision requires the full deployment of the rational evaluation. It is the life in which the significant behavioral choices, the communications that shape relationships, the decisions that shape trajectories, the treatments of others that shape the quality of all the relationships they constitute, are made from the genuine, deliberate, values-aligned assessment rather than from the automatic pattern. The small choices can often run on the rebuilt automatic defaults of the new pattern infrastructure. The significant ones are genuinely chosen. Long-term thinking is the specific cognitive orientation of the person who has stopped reacting to everything, the orientation toward the extended consequence evaluation that the reactive pattern's time frame compression was systematically preventing. The person who is not reacting to every immediate trigger is freed from the constant attentional demand of the management of the reactive pattern's outputs. The attentional resource that was consumed by the managing of the reactive behavior's consequences is now available for the genuine forward thinking that the non-reactive person can conduct, the deliberate consideration of the trajectory, the deliberate planning of the development, the deliberate cultivation of the relationships, and the capabilities that the genuine purposes require. Internal control is the cumulative expression of everything this audiobook has been building, the specific governance of the behavioral output by the deliberate mind rather than by the automatic pattern, maintained consistently across the full range of conditions that the engaged life produces. The internal control is not control over the external circumstances. The circumstances are what they are, and the non-creative person does not control them through the development of their non-creativity. The internal control is control over the response to the circumstances, the specific governance that keeps the response the expression of the deliberate assessment rather than the automatic execution of the pattern. The identity of the non-reactive person is the identity of the person who lives from the inside out rather than from the outside, and whose behavior is the expression of their own deliberate character rather than the output of the environmental inputs that the reactive pattern was amplifying and expressing. This identity is not arrived at in a single transformation. It is built through the accumulated evidence of many governed moments, many pauses maintained, many reactive patterns interrupted, many deliberate responses chosen instead of the automatic ones. When you stop reacting, you start leading. The leadership is not over others, it is the specific self-governance that is the foundation of all genuine engagement with the world. The governance of your attention, your decisions, your communications, your treatment of others, and the direction of the life trajectory that the accumulated choices constitute. This is the destination, this is the identity. And this is what the 10 chapters of this audiobook have been building toward from the first sentence. You can stop reacting to everything. You can train your brain to stay in control. The training is the 10 chapters you have just completed and the many ordinary days of practice that those chapters have prepared you for. Closing. The deliberate life. 10 chapters, 1 transformation. From the person whose behavior is produced by the automatic patterns to the person whose behavior is the deliberate expression of their own genuine assessment. From the predictable reactor whose triggers are known and whose outputs are available to whoever manages those triggers, to the person who governs their own behavior from the inside rather than having it governed from the outside. Chapter 1 named the habit the automatic reaction that does not choose. That happens, that builds its own identity through the accumulated evidence of many instances. Chapter 2 named the mechanism you are programmed. Not weak, the fast shortcut system, the emotional speed advantage, the commitment problem, and the specific implication the reprogramming is possible through the specific practices that build the competing infrastructure. Chapter 3 named the cost-damaged relationships, poor decisions, the loss of control over life direction. Not from any single catastrophic reaction, but from the accumulated texture of many small reactive instances that together constitute the trajectory produced by the pattern rather than the trajectory chosen by the person. Chapter 4 built the first practice slowing down, breaking urgency, creating the awareness before the response, generating the mental space in which the deliberate response becomes possible. Chapter 5 developed the pause, the single most practically powerful tool in the anti-greedivity practice. The myropause in conversation, the interrupting of the emotional reaction, the choosing instead of the executing. Chapter 6 built the rewiring, the recognition of the existing pattern, the design of the alternative routine, the consistent practice that builds the competing infrastructure across the weeks and months that genuine neural restructuring requires. Chapter 7 tested the practices and the real situations: conflict, sustained stress, and social pressure. Chapter 8 connected the practices to the thinking before cating process, the rational filters, the outcome evaluation, the strategic response that the interval of the pause makes available. Chapter 9 named the destination of the development: mental stability as a built skill, emotional discipline as the ongoing practice, consistency as the behavioral expression, calm mindset as the internal orientation. And Chapter 10 named the life-conscious living with the extended time horizon and the genuine internal control that the developed non-reactivity produces. The governance of the behavioral output by the deliberate assessment. The self-leadership that begins when the reactivity stops. The pattern will continue to fire. The triggers will arrive. The activation will begin. The automatic response will be waiting. What is different now is the architecture between the trigger and the action. The trigger arrives. You feel the activation. You recognize the pattern beginning. You pause. You think. You choose. That is not reacting. That is living. Deliberately.